Marcus Tullius Cicero. So Tullius was his family name, like Julius Caesar. Tullius is Cicero's family name. And then his sort of nickname, we could even call it, was Cicero. And in Latin, it would be Cicero. But we're not familiar with Cicero, so we'll stick with Cicero. Cicero is, I think it's fair to say, one of the maybe half dozen most important figures in the Western tradition. So that puts him way up at the top of the list of important people. Why? Why is he so important? Well, first of all, his life, his actual life that was lived in Rome, is an extraordinary life that runs parallel to all the great figures in that first century. So the first century period, 100 down to 0, is the most difficult 100 years in all of the Roman Empire. And of course, the Roman Empire is very important to us because we know it's the model for our own founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution. So therefore, people who look back at the first century always cared about what happened. They cared about the evolution from the 100 moment down to 50, down to 44, down to 20 and 10. So it was important to everybody from then on, and that's 2,000 more years, about what happened. And in that story of 100 years from 100 down to 0, he's born at the year 106. His generation is born 105, 104, 100. But all that generation then lives from about 100 down to 40 or longer. If they had longer than 60 years, maybe to 30 BC. And in that generation and in that group of people, along with Julius Caesar, Cicero is the second most important Roman. And if we made a list of the 10 most influential people in the whole of the Western tradition, he would definitely be on the list. So why? Why is Cicero so important? Well, in the long story for us here, and our story that we are talking about is about 5,000 years. So if we start at 2000 BC and then come down to present time, we have a little more than 4,000, closer to 5,000 years of history. And in that 3,000 or 4,000 years, half of it, of course, is from Rome to the present. And during that half of the long story of Western Civ, Cicero is always known. He's one of the few people who writes a book, or several books, that is read without interruption. So Cicero's book on duties is read without interruption from the time he writes it. Julius Caesar's Conquest of Gaul is in the same category. Both those books in Latin are read without interruption. It's never lost at any time. 100, 200, 300, the Dark Ages 500, 700, 800. They're never lost. There's always somebody reading both of those books and thinking about what he's written. And then in the Renaissance at 1400, everybody's reading it. And in 1500, even more people are reading it. And by 1600, even more people are reading it. And that's just continued right up to the present time. In terms of influence, there are very few names of people whose work is read without interruption. So, for example, if we switch over to the Greeks, and if we take Aristotle and Plato, there's a huge interruption of nobody in the West reading either one of them. About 1,000 years or more. So from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, which is roughly 1,000 years, 500 to 1,500, for about 1,000 years, nobody in Paris or London can read or is reading Plato and Aristotle because they don't have translations and they don't have copies of the Greek and they don't know Greek. So there's no name that we could take from Greece and say, well, didn't just as many people read, say, Socrates? No, because of course Socrates didn't write anything. So I class myself with Socrates in, category of great teachers who never wrote a book. So Cicero, as a great hero of the Western tradition, is one of those rare writers whose books are great books and who is read without interruption for 2,000 years plus. So that really sets him apart. There are a few other Romans like it. Virgil's in the same category. People always have the Aeneid and always read it. But then there aren't many others. So number one, influence, there's the influence as a person in Rome. And then there's the whole issue of him being a great writer. And he was a great writer. He wrote a series of books that are read continuously to this day, more than one title, but De Officiis by itself is a great title. And then he wrote letters, and the letters were collected and published, and people have been reading the letters for 2,000 years. So you have him unique in that way too. As far as, influential figures in the Western tradition, it's hard to imagine anyone more influential than Cicero. Incidentally, if you read Michael Grant's introduction to your Penguin Classic collection of his letters and other essays, it's a great introduction. It's a beautiful essay on Cicero. So if you haven't read it yet, go read it, because you will find it a wonderful, say, 50-page summary of Cicero's life and works. And we just told you about the Loeb Classical Library collection. So this is a collection of the letters, and so you can read through a lot of the ones we have in our Penguin Classic. And this is the world in which he lived. These are the people who are his contemporaries. So you can see Cicero is 100 to 44, so he's just a few years older than Caesar. Pompey is a few years, Pompey's exactly the same age as Cicero, dies in 48. Cicero has 5 more years. Crassus is a little older and dies a little earlier than they do. Cicero is 100 to 43. Brutus, who is the son, we presume, of Julius Caesar by Servilia, which would have been born when he was 20 or so, 20, 25, is, of course, present at the assassination. And Cato is dead before the assassination in 44, but Cato is one of the great voices of the Republic. So he's constantly making speeches in the Senate in favor of the Republic and the freedom of the Republic. So here's our hero. And what do we remember about him? Well, number one, he was a brilliant lawyer. Now, all these people that we mentioned tonight, almost every single man is also a trained lawyer and practices at some point in their life. Now, they may not practice very long. Julius Caesar didn't need to because he went into the military, he had a big military career, but that means that he's a legal scholar, and all these people, Pompey's the same way, and all the other people in their category. So as a young person, they would go to law school in Rome, and then go on in a career of some kind. So he's a lawyer, he's a senator, he's a writer and author of multiple books, and he's a classical scholar. And when I say that, I mean in Rome, he's a Greek scholar. He reads Greek, he studied in Greece, he studied in Athens, just like Julius Caesar, and his friend Atticus, who lives in Greece. His friend Atticus is a name that was made up just to cover the person living there in Greece, and then he's the most influential Latin author ever. There's no one else who wrote Latin prose who's as influential as Cicero, and I would say he's more influential than Virgil, because everybody didn't read the Aeneid. Everybody didn't get it, in the year 1250 or something. But everybody got Cicero. Everybody understood.